How do you fight a war that your own government refuses to admit is happening? How do you kill men in a country your nation is officially not at war with? Board a transport aircraft home and tell your family you spent 6 months on routine training exercises? How do you watch a region come within reach of nuclear catastrophe while the rest of the world stares at Vietnam? Between 1963 and 1966, Australia fought a full military campaign of secret cross-border raids, naval engagements, and jungle ambushes conducted deep inside the sovereign territory of its nearest large neighbor, against a nation whose leader was simultaneously trying to acquire atomic weapons from communist China, and the Australian public knew absolutely nothing about any of it. The men who fought that war were ordered to strip their identification discs from their necks before crossing the border. Their casualties were officially reported as having occurred somewhere they had not been. Their own government would not acknowledge what they had done for 31 years. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Konfrontasi before today? Because what you are about to discover will rewrite everything you thought you knew about Cold War Asia, and it will force you to ask a question that has never been answered properly. How much peace is too much to pay for? To understand how Australia ended up fighting a secret war against Indonesia while maintaining diplomatic relations with Indonesia and simultaneously preparing for an entirely different conflict in Vietnam, you first have to understand what the world looked like when the Second World War ended and the map of Asia began redrawing itself. The European empires that had spent 3 centuries carving up the continent were retreating on every front. The Dutch were losing Indonesia. The French were losing Indochina. The British were managing their imperial withdrawal on a schedule and with paperwork, granting formal independence to territories whose actual readiness for it was, in most cases, far less important than the political timetable in London. What they left behind were borders that had been drawn by administrators who had never stood in the places they were dividing. Borders that cut through languages and through centuries of trade routes and through the kind of geographical reality that only reveals itself when you are inside it rather than looking at it on a map. Nowhere was this cartographic inheritance more dangerous than on the island of Borneo. Borneo is an island the size of South Australia, an almost incomprehensible mass of rainforest that runs 3 layers deep from the canopy to the floor, mountain ranges, and rivers used as roads because there are no other roads, all wrapped in a climate that treats the human body as a temporary inconvenience rather than a priority. In the early 1960s, this island was divided between 4 political entities. The southern 2/3 belonged to Indonesia, called Kalimantan. The northern third was split between 3 British territories, the Crown Colony of Sarawak, the Crown Colony of North Borneo, which would soon become Sabah, and the tiny oil-rich Sultanate of Brunei. The border between the Indonesian south and the British north ran for 1,450 kilometers through some of the most impenetrable terrain on the planet. There were no road crossings. In some areas, the border was so undefined on the ground that a patrol could cross it without knowing they had done so. From a strategic standpoint, defending it by conventional means was not a challenge. It was a mathematical impossibility. Into this geography stepped a man who would provide the fuse. Sukarno, born Koesno Sosrodiharjo, on the 6th of June, 1901, in Surabaya, on the island of Java, was by any measure one of the most extraordinary political figures of the 20th century. He had led Indonesia's independence movement against Dutch colonial rule, spent years in prison and internal exile, declared independence unilaterally on the 17th of August, 1945, 2 days after the Japanese surrender, and before the Dutch could return, and then fought a 4-year revolutionary war until the Netherlands recognized Indonesian sovereignty in 1949. He was charismatic in a way that photographs cannot communicate, a man whose speeches could fill a stadium for hours, whose personality could fill a room without him saying a word, who had built a nation of 17,000 islands and 250 languages out of the sheer force of his insistence that they were one people. By the early 1960s, however, the revolutionary energy that had made him unstoppable was curdling into something more unstable. He had introduced what he called guided democracy, an authoritarian balancing act between 3 enormous competing forces: the army, the Indonesian Communist Party, known as the PKY, and his own nationalist movement. The PKY was the 3rd largest communist party in the world outside the Soviet bloc and China, with millions of members inside the 4th most populous nation on earth. The army despised it. Sukarno kept both forces in check by positioning himself as indispensable to both and by manufacturing foreign crises that allowed him to perform the role of champion of Indonesian greatness against external imperialists. He had done this successfully with the Dutch in New Guinea. He was about to attempt it again, but this time the crisis would find him rather than the other way around. When the British announced their plan for a federation of Malaysia, a merger of Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, and North Borneo, Sukarno identified it as a British plot to preserve colonial influence in Southeast Asia behind the fig leaf of independence. He was not entirely without evidence for this view. The British were indeed motivated partly by a desire to maintain their naval base at Singapore and their economic relationships throughout the region. But Sukarno's response transformed a legitimate political objection into something that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. He decided that Malaysia must not be permitted to exist, and he found a man with exactly the right instrument to begin the destruction. On the 20th of January, 1963, Indonesia's foreign minister, Dr. Subandrio, an accomplished diplomat who understood that a well-chosen word used at the right moment is more dangerous than most weapons, appeared before the world and announced that Indonesia's policy toward the proposed Malaysian Federation would be one of confrontasi. Confrontation. He did not define what that meant. The absence of definition was the genius of the choice. Confrontasi could mean diplomatic pressure, or economic warfare, or propaganda, or low-level military action, or all 4 simultaneously. It allowed Indonesia to wage a war without declaring one, to deny involvement in any specific incident while fostering all of them, and to place the onus of formal escalation on Britain and its allies. It was not a military strategy dressed in diplomatic language. It was a legal fiction that enabled a military strategy, and it was one of the most sophisticated deployments of political language in the entire Cold War. Sukarno had not declared war. He had declared something that could become a war if he needed it to, and could remain something short of war if he did not. 4 months before Subandrio's announcement, a telephone call had already set in motion the military response that would eventually break Konfrontasi from the inside. On the 8th of December, 1962, while visiting Gurkha pensioners in the Himalayas and several days' walk from any transport, a British Major General named Walter Collier. Walker received word that a revolt had broken out in the Sultanate of Brunei. He spent 9 days fighting his way to communications and then to Singapore, and on the 19th of December he was appointed Commander British Forces Borneo. Born on the 11th of November, 1912, on a tea plantation in Cuttack, India, to a military family, educated at Blundell's School in Devon, where he immediately began drilling the other pupils into parade ground order because their idleness offended him. Walker had spent his entire career in the jungle. He had commanded the 4th 8th Gurkha Rifles against the Japanese in Burma, led them across the Irrawaddy River in 1945 in some of the hardest fighting of the Pacific War, and during the Malayan emergency had hunted communist guerrillas through the jungle with such systematic patience that their numbers fell from 8,000 to fewer than 500. He once ordered an ambush group to stay in position for 28 days. He had been threatened with a court-martial for his unauthorized campaign to protect the Gurkha regiments from post-war defense cuts. He had been forced to apologize to the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He had done so without for a single moment entertaining the possibility that he had been wrong. He was, by every account of those who served under and over him, without equal in his chosen field of jungle warfare, and virtually impossible to work alongside if you valued your composure above your competence. Walker arrived in Borneo to find 5 infantry battalions responsible for defending 1,450 kilometers of jungle border, an obvious impossibility by any conventional calculation. His response was to change the terms of the calculation entirely. He issued a directive for success built on 5 principles: unified command across all 3 services, continuous intelligence gathering, concentration of force, rapid deployment, and added later when he understood the true nature of the conflict, winning the hearts and minds of the border peoples. The last principle was not charity dressed as tactics. It was the foundation on which everything else rested. The Iban people of the Borneo interior, indigenous inhabitants of the jungle, possessed an understanding of their environment that no amount of military training could replicate. Their knowledge of every trail, every river crossing, every seasonal movement pattern was the intelligence infrastructure that would ultimately allow Walker to dominate a border that he could never physically hold. The relationship had to be earned through medical care provided in remote villages, through practical assistance offered without conditions, through the kind of consistent respect that distinguishes an ally from an occupier. Walker understood this. Not every general in his position would have. His strategic insight went deeper still. The border, Walker decided, was not a line to be defended. It was an environment to be dominated. And the only way to dominate it was to make Indonesia more afraid of what waited for them on their own side of the line than motivated by what they hoped to achieve on the Malaysian side. He could not act on this insight immediately. But it was already forming when the first Indonesian raids began crossing the border in early 1963. Small parties of men described as volunteers, attacking police stations in Sarawak, spreading propaganda in border villages, returning to Kalimantan before the Gurkhas could pin them down. The word volunteer was doing exactly the same work as the word confrontasi, providing legal cover for an activity that was unmistakably military. Malaysia officially came into being on the 16th of September, 1963. In Jakarta, the news was received with violence. Mobs burned down the British embassy, ransacked the Malaysian embassy, and left the Australian embassy conspicuously untouched. Indonesia understood that Australia was the soft point in the alliance it was confronting, the country that needed to be managed separately from the British, and the gesture was as deliberate as Subandrio's choice of vocabulary. Sukarno left no one uncertain about his personal position. He declared publicly that he would gobble Malaysia raw. It was the kind of statement that made him easy to dismiss in the chancelleries of the Western world, and that is precisely the danger that came from dismissing it. 1964 was the year the Konfrontasi nearly became something that cannot be contained in a word. The escalation that year moved on multiple tracks simultaneously, each one more alarming than the last, and together they created a situation that was considerably closer to catastrophe than almost anyone acknowledged at the time. In January, the United States. Watching Indonesia's drift toward the communist bloc with the particular anxiety of a superpower invested in every domino between Hawaii and the English Channel, threatened to cut off foreign aid unless Sukarno wound down his campaign. Sukarno told the Americans to go to hell, not in diplomatic language, in those words. He then committed regular Indonesian army units to Borneo, replacing the deniable volunteers with uniformed soldiers, and ordered his military to plan for a decisive escalation. By August, he had authorized something that crossed every line of the Konfrontasi framework. Indonesian regular soldiers conducted seaborne and airborne landings on the Malaysian mainland itself, not in Borneo, but at Labas and Pontian in Johor State, less than 100 miles north of Singapore. Uniformed soldiers of the Indonesian army landing on Malaysian territory. An act of war by every definition the word has ever carried. No war was declared. The Australian 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, stationed at Camp Tarandak in Malacca, was deployed alongside British and Malaysian forces to hunt down and round up the Indonesian paratroopers. Australians were killing Indonesians on the Malay Peninsula, while the Australian government continued to maintain diplomatic relations with Jakarta and continued to refuse British requests to deploy combat forces to Borneo. This contradiction was not accidental. The Australian government under Prime Minister Robert Menzies was playing an extraordinarily difficult diplomatic hand. It needed Malaysia to survive. It was treaty-bound to support British military operations. It feared that open Australian combat against Indonesia would provoke Indonesian military action against the long, indefensible jungle border between Indonesia and the Australian-administered territory of Papua and New Guinea. And it was watching with specific alarm as Indonesia drew closer to China, which had detonated its first nuclear weapon in October of 1964. Becoming a nuclear power in the immediate region with implications for every strategic calculation Australia had made since the Second World War. So the government maintained its diplomatic channels with Jakarta, continued to describe its military involvement as something less than combat, and managed the contradiction with the kind of skill that never receives public credit because it only works when no one notices it is being applied. What was entirely invisible to the Australian public, and what would remain invisible for more than 30 years, was the dimension of the crisis that made the nuclear question not a theoretical concern, but an immediate, operational one. In July of 1964, Sukarno publicly announced that Indonesia would build its own atomic bomb. In the classified cables of American intelligence, this was taken with complete seriousness. Indonesia's General Hartono, director of the Army Arsenal, stated that Indonesia planned to detonate a device by 1969. The declassified documents of the United States State Department reveal something still more alarming. Indonesian officials were actively exploring whether China could detonate a nuclear weapon in Indonesian territorial waters and allow the Sukarno government to take credit for the test. American analysts assessed that such a detonation would enhance Sukarno's prestige and would, in the precise language of the declassified document, quite frankly, shock the British and their Malaysian allies, along with Australia. The Chinese ultimately declined to share their nuclear technology, and the program never reached operational capability. But the fact that these conversations were happening, that a government already conducting undeclared military operations against a neighboring state, was simultaneously pursuing weapons of mass destruction with Chinese assistance during a conflict in which Australia had combat troops tells you something definitive about how close to the edge the Konfrontasi came to going. The Cuban Missile Crisis has an entire historical literature dedicated to how close it came to ending civilization. The Konfrontasi nuclear near-miss has, until now, almost none. It was against this backdrop of an undeclared war on two fronts, a failed American intervention, a Chinese nuclear test that had just changed the regional strategic calculus, and a leader in Jakarta who was exploring atomic weapons, that Walker received authorization in July of 1964 for the operation that would define the war. He called it Operation Claret. It was a series of cross-border raids by Commonwealth forces into Indonesian Kalimantan, offensive military operations inside the sovereign territory of a nation with whom there was no declaration of war, conducted by soldiers carrying no identification, leaving no evidence, whose casualties would be officially reported as having occurred on the Malaysian side of the border. Walker established 7 golden rules. Penetration was limited, initially to 3,000 yards, and later extended as the military situation demanded. Attacks were authorized only to thwart specific enemy offensive operations, never as retaliation for Commonwealth losses. Civilian casualties were never to be risked under any circumstances. Every operation was to be planned and rehearsed to the highest possible standard of security. No identification discs were to be worn. No identifiable material was to be left in Kalimantan. Every soldier involved was sworn to absolute secrecy. The operations were deniable, and because their exposure would force the full-scale war that everyone was trying to prevent, they could not officially exist. By December of 1964, Australian intelligence confirmed what Walker had already suspected. Indonesian forces were massing in Kalimantan opposite the West Brigade area of operations. A major offensive was being prepared. London deployed 2 additional British battalions to Borneo, and Canberra received a direct request from the Malaysian government that could no longer be deferred without consequences for the alliance that Australia's own security depended upon. The political agonizing that had defined Australia's confrontasi policy for 2 years ended in January of 1965. The Menzies government agreed to deploy the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and a squadron of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment to Borneo. It was announced in language calibrated to minimize the appearance of escalation. Its meaning, in the jungle, would be considerably less diplomatic. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment that received its deployment orders was a young institution, formed as a company of 180 men as recently as 1957, elevated to regimental status on the 20th of August, 1964, barely 5 months before the Borneo commitment. It had never been to war. Borneo would be the regiment's first operational deployment, the test of everything it believed about itself. And though no one standing on the tarmac at Butterworth in early 1965 could have known this, the crucible in which everything the Australian military would later apply in Vietnam would be forged and proven. The 1st Squadron arrived in Brunei in February of 1965. The 3rd Battalion arrived in Sarawak in March, formally relieving the 1st/7th Gurkhas in the Bau area on the 22nd of the month. What greeted them was an environment that treated the phrase hostile terrain as something of an understatement. The Borneo jungle is hostile not in the way a desert is hostile, through exposure and thirst and absence of cover, but in the way a living organism is hostile, actively, specifically, and with extraordinary variety. The heat never relents. The humidity at 90% and above is constant for months. The canopy of vegetation runs 3 layers deep, blocking sunlight so completely that the jungle floor is permanent twilight in some areas, and visibility is measured in meters rather than the hundreds of meters a soldier needs to function confidently. Leeches find their way through every gap in clothing. Fire ants whose bite burns for hours live in the vegetation at every level. Mosquitoes carry disease. And the jungle is noisy in ways that mask both the approach of the enemy and the sounds a patrol inadvertently makes until the animals fall silent, which is when a skilled jungle fighter knows that something has changed. And the seconds before he understands what are the most dangerous seconds of the patrol. The first member of the Australian Special Air Service to die on active service overseas was not killed by an Indonesian soldier. He was not killed by a landmine, a booby trap, or a sniper. Lance Corporal Paul Dennehy was killed by a wild elephant, a rogue bull that his patrol encountered in the jungle of Sarawak, whose tusk inflicted a wound so catastrophic that Dennehy spent several days in agony before dying from it. His death does not appear in most histories of the Konfrontasi. It does not fit the expected shape of a military narrative, but it is the most accurate possible introduction to what the first Australian patrols actually confronted. Not just an enemy, but an environment that would kill you in ways that no doctrine had thought to anticipate, that demanded a form of physical and psychological resilience that went considerably beyond anything described in a training manual. The SASR's initial patrols on the Malaysian side of the border served 2 purposes simultaneously. The first was tactical, gathering topographical intelligence on trails and river crossings, mapping the infiltration routes used by Indonesian incursions, building the surveillance picture that Claret operations would require. The second was strategic, and it was the one that Walker had identified as foundational from his first days in Borneo. The Iban people, indigenous inhabitants of the interior, distributed across longhouses that were the social and political units of their world, possessed a knowledge of the jungle that was incomparably superior to anything the Australian Army could provide. They knew every track. They knew which river crossings were used regularly and by whom. They had been trading across the Kalimantan border for generations and had watched the Indonesian military build up its presence in the border region, with the attentiveness of people whose survival had always depended on knowing what was moving through the country around them. Their cooperation was worth more than any electronic surveillance system the Commonwealth possessed. It was also not for sale. It had to be earned through medical care provided to remote communities, through practical assistance offered without conditions, through the kind of consistent respect that distinguishes an ally from an occupier. The Australians earned it. And the intelligence that flowed back through that network allowed Claret operations to be targeted with a precision that transformed a handful of platoon-strength patrols into something that felt, to the Indonesians receiving their attention, like an omniscient threat. In late April of 1965, Australian soldiers received authorization for their first cross-border operations. They removed their identification discs. They taped over every surface that could reflect light. They eliminated every piece of equipment that could produce sound. They crossed the border into Indonesian Kalimantan, and what they did there would remain classified for more than 3 decades. The 27th of April, 1965, did not begin with the Australians. It began at 5:05 in the morning at a forward base called Plaman, Mapu, a jungle hillock 1,800 meters from the Indonesian border in Sarawak, held by 36 men of B Company, 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, in the middle of a monsoon that had been running for days. The rest of the company was out on its 10-day jungle patrol cycle. The base was down to its minimum holding force. Indonesian intelligence had been watching. They had observed the rotation pattern, noted when the base was most vulnerable, and calculated that their assault force, soldiers of the RPKAD, the Regiment para Komando Angkatan Darat, and Indonesia's most capable Special Forces unit, would overwhelm the skeleton garrison before the rest of B Company could return. 400 men against 36. By any arithmetic, there was only one outcome. At 5:05, in driving monsoon rain that reduced visibility to almost nothing, the attack began simultaneously from multiple directions. Mortars, rocket launchers, and machine guns opened at once. Indonesian soldiers armed with AK-47 rifles and Bangalore torpedoes, which are long tubes of explosive used to breach wire obstacles, surged forward toward the British perimeter. They breached the wire on one section of the position, overran a mortar pit, and killed 2 defenders in the initial assault. Company Sergeant Major John Williams, the most senior man present since his officers were out on patrol, came out of his sleeping quarters in the pitch dark and the rain without his shirt on and began organizing the defense. He led counterattacks across a position he could barely see toward enemy soldiers. He could hear more than he could identify. Shrapnel from an explosion blinded him in one eye. He kept fighting. He organized a second counterattack. He organized a third. The general-purpose machine guns on the flanks held. Artillery called from kilometers away through the rain began arriving. The battle lasted almost 2 hours. When the Indonesians finally withdrew across the border, they left an estimated 50 casualties behind them. 2 British paratroopers were dead. Williams received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the highest decoration for gallantry available to a non-commissioned officer below the Victoria Cross, and later described the night with the economy of a man who has understood something at very close range. He said he bounded out of bed. It was pitch black, blinding with rain. It was a monsoon, and it was coming down hard. The Battle of Plaman Mapu was, by the assessment of almost everyone who studied the campaign that followed, the decisive moment of the Konfrontasi. Never again did the Indonesian army attempt a major cross-border assault against a Commonwealth position. They had sent their best soldiers against a skeleton British garrison with 4-1 numerical advantage and lost. The political consequence in Jakarta was severe in proportion to the confidence that had been invested in the operation. Sukarno had needed a triumph. The RPKAD's failure deepened the fractures within the Indonesian military's confidence in the entire Konfrontasi strategy, fractures that would become catastrophically relevant 5 months later. General Lea, Walker's replacement as Director of Borneo Operations, responded by extending Claret penetration authority to 10,000 yards inside Kalimantan and stated his intention to make absolutely clear to the Indonesians that their proper place was behind their own frontier. The Australians were about to demonstrate what that meant in practical terms. The 24th of May, 1965, Major William Broderick departed the company base at Bukit Knuckle with 2 platoons from B Company, 3 RAR, 5 platoon and 11 platoon, and a forward observation party. The operation was designated Article. They crossed the border into Kalimantan and moved to a position on the bank of the Sungai Coemba, a river that Australian intelligence had identified as a regular Indonesian supply and movement route. They occupied their ambush position and waited. This is where the genuine courage of these operations lived, not primarily in the shooting, but in the stillness that preceded it. Men lying motionless in undergrowth, meters from an active enemy route, in heat that does not relent, attacked by insects that do not pause, unable to move or cough or swat the leeches, finding their way through every gap in clothing for as many hours and days as necessary. The discipline required is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is a sustained act of will against every physical instinct the body possesses, maintained for as long as the mission demands in conditions specifically designed by nature to make it impossible. On the 27th of May, Indonesian troops came along the river in boats, moving with the ease of men who expected no hazard on their own side of the border. The Australians triggered the ambush. The engagement was brief and entirely one-sided. Significant Indonesian casualties. No Australians lost. Broderick's force withdrew and returned to the company base. The absence of any Indonesian counter-patrol afterward told its own story. They did not know where the attack had come from. They had no frame of reference for ambushes inside Kalimantan. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Robert Guest led 7 Platoon, C Company, across the border with his company commander, Major Ivor Hodgkinson, the battalion intelligence officer, and a New Zealand artillery forward observation party. The operation was designated Fawn Fair. The ambush position was further downstream on the Sungai Coemba than the previous one, closer to the Indonesian forward positions at Siding. They occupied their position before dawn on the 11th of June. During the course of the day, 2 civilian boats passed through the killing area. They were allowed to pass. 3 more the following morning. Allowed to pass. The discipline required to watch potential targets move through a carefully prepared ambush position. To hold fire, to make a precise professional assessment in fractions of a second, and then to return to stillness as though nothing had happened, is a form of competence that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not been required to exercise it. At 11:45 on the morning of the 12th of June, a sentry on the left flank warned of Indonesian troops approaching along the riverbank. The ambush triggered. The result was the same as the previous month. Heavy Indonesian casualties. No Australians lost. The supply route that Indonesian forces had used with complete confidence was now killing them. And the most disturbing aspect of it, from the Indonesian side, was that they still could not determine where the attacks were originating. 3 days after that, on the 15th of June, 1965, 2nd Lieutenant Douglas Byers led 2 platoon, a company, across the border to a position near Kindau, 1,300 meters inside Kalimantan. He established his ambush astride a track running west from the border, with a firm base to the rear, cut-off positions secured with claymore mines on the flanks, and a killing group of 14 men on the track. They lay there for 3 days, 72 hours of the stillness described above, in a position within easy striking distance of Indonesian forces, large enough to annihilate them without difficulty. On the afternoon of the 15th, at 1:26, the sentries identified movement to the east. A large Indonesian force was approaching along the track, moving in column, one behind the other, weapons slung, with the unhurried confidence of troops in what they believed was their own secure territory. They were regular soldiers, AR-15 Armalites on their backs, U.S.-issue steel helmets, moving toward an ambush they had no reason to anticipate. Byers waited until approximately 25 of them had entered the killing ground. Then he opened fire. The first burst of his Owen submachine gun killed at least 12 men. The 3 lead soldiers who had already passed through the ambush ran forward and into the claymores of the cut-off party. They were killed instantly. The surviving Indonesians reacted with the speed of well-trained soldiers. They went to ground, returned fire, brought up a machine gun and mortars. The machine gun was silenced almost immediately by Australian small arms fire. The mortars were suppressed by counter-battery work. But the Indonesian force numbered up to 100 men, and only its lead element had been caught in the ambush. Bayer's platoon took 2 wounded before the forward observation party brought artillery fire down on the Indonesian positions. When the patrol withdrew to their firm base and began moving back toward the border, they left 17 confirmed Indonesian dead on the track. The actual toll, the forward observer believed, was closer to 25. 2 Australians with wounds that would heal. The patrol crossed back into Malaysia carrying both men. The Battle of Qingdao was the one Claret action that the Australian press briefly touched, not because the security apparatus failed, but because a journalist managed to interview one of the wounded Australians before the classification protocols caught up with the story. The resulting report reached Australian newspapers. It described the engagement as having occurred inside Malaysian territory. The fiction held by the narrowest possible margin, because the journalist had no means of verifying the location. The men who knew understood how close the entire operation had come to exposure. Claret's deniability, constructed by Walker with such care, had survived its most dangerous moment. The 4th ambush came on the 12th of July, 1965. Lieutenant Guest returned, 7 platoon, C Company again, the same men who had sprung the 2nd Sungai Coemba ambush the previous month, with Hodgkinson, the intelligence officer, and a fire control party. The target was a well-used track near the Indonesian base at Babang. At midday, approximately 30 Indonesian soldiers came down the track. The ambush triggered. At least 13 killed. The survivors counterattacked. The Australians withdrew under defensive artillery cover. No Australians lost. 4 ambushes in 7 weeks. 4 engagements on Indonesian sovereign territory against some of Indonesia's best regular soldiers. 4 complete Australian tactical successes. Not one Australian killed in direct combat contact across the entire campaign. General Leah ordered a pause in Claret operations following Babang to observe the effects. The effect was unambiguous. The Indonesian mortar attacks on Australian company bases, which had been heavy and sustained throughout May and June, ceased. The Indonesians had stopped because they could no longer calculate where the next ambush would come from. The psychological dominance that Walker had theorized about 2 years earlier, when he looked at a map of Borneo and decided that the border was not a line to be defended, but an environment to be dominated, had been achieved. The Indonesians had the numbers. They had the artillery. They had elite units that were not to be underestimated. Every conventional measure of combat power pointed toward an Indonesian advantage. The results in the field pointed somewhere else entirely. 3,050 Indonesian regular soldiers were deployed in the 3 RAR operational area alone, supported by artillery and 81mm mortars, including elements of the RPKAD and the Diponegoro Division, among the finest units the Indonesian Army possessed. Against this force, the Australians deployed patrols of platoon strength, between 20 and 30 men, for specific time-limited actions followed by immediate withdrawal. The 32 Claret operations conducted by 3 RAR during its 4-month tour resulted in 4 major engagements, all ending in clear Australian victory. 3 Australians were killed during the entire Borneo tour. All 3 died to land mines. Not one was killed in direct combat engagement. It is one of the most remarkable combat records in the history of Australian arms. It is also almost entirely unknown. Across the entire Operation Claret campaign, more than 545 operations conducted by British, Commonwealth, Australian, and New Zealand forces from January of 1965 through July of 1966, the disproportionality of outcomes was consistent. Claret operations inflicted an estimated 300 or more Indonesian dead against fewer than 10 Commonwealth losses in direct engagements. The Indonesians were kept permanently on the defensive, uncertain of when and where the next strike would come, unable to plan offensive operations with any confidence because their own staging areas were no longer safe. Walker's theory of victory had been proven correct in every operational detail. The answer to whether it would be enough came not from the jungle, but from Jakarta, and it came with a violence that ended the Konfrontasi more completely than any ambush ever could have. On the night of the 30th of September, 1965, a group calling themselves the September 30th Movement kidnapped and murdered 6 senior generals of the Indonesian army in Jakarta. The perpetrators claimed to be acting against a right-wing military conspiracy. General Sukarno, Army Reserve Commander, a man who combined the strategic instincts of a chess player with the decisive speed of a combat soldier, responded within hours. By dawn of the 1st of October, he had control of the army. Within a week, the movement was crushed. And then Suharto did the thing that would change the history of Indonesia and of the Konfrontasi and of several 100,000 human lives. He blamed the Indonesian Communist Party. Whether the PKI leadership had genuinely directed the September 30th movement is a question that serious historians have argued for 60 years without producing consensus. What followed the accusation is beyond dispute. Beginning in October of 1965 and continuing through the early months of 1966, the Indonesian army, joined by religious youth groups, nationalist militias, and local vigilantes, began killing PKI members and suspected sympathizers on a scale that the outside world did not fully comprehend until it was over. The killing spread from Jakarta to Central Java, to East Java, to Bali, to northern Sumatra. The dead numbered somewhere between 500,000 and more than 1 million human beings. The PKI, which had been the 3rd largest communist party in the world with millions of members across the country, ceased to exist as a functioning political organization within months. It was not a purge in the sense that word usually implies. It was an erasure. What the declassified cables from the Australian National Archives reveal about Australia's conduct during this period belongs to the same story as the ambushes on the Sungai Coemba, and it has never received the public accounting it deserves. Australian Ambassador Keith Shan cabled the Department of External Affairs on the 5th of October, 1965, days after the killing began, expressing that he devoutly hoped the army would act firmly against the PKI. Later that month, he informed Canberra that he had personally witnessed approximately 250 prisoners being taken away by the army. By January of 1966, the Australian, American, and British embassies were exchanging detailed information on the dismemberment of the PKI, while casualty estimates climbed past 100,000, then 200,000, then beyond any reliable accounting. A young embassy official named Sterry traveled to Bali, Flores, and Timor in February of 1966 and saw victims' heads displayed on spikes in villages. He reported this to Canberra. Radio Australia, the government broadcaster, was used to relay Indonesian army propaganda into the country during the purge, contributing to the atmosphere of anti-communist hysteria that facilitated the killings. By mid-1966, Prime Minister Harold Holt expressed what the historical record captures as satisfaction with the pro-Western shift in Indonesian foreign and economic policy that the massacres had produced. There is a line of causation running from the failed RPKAD assault at Plaman, Mapu in April of 1965 to the Indonesian Army's decision to move against Sukarno's coalition when the opportunity arrived in September of that year. And it runs through the Australian ambush campaign on the Sungai Coemba and at Kindau and Babang. The military failures in Borneo contributed to the Army's disillusionment with the Konfrontasi strategy. That disillusionment contributed to the Army's readiness to act. The men who lay in silence on the banks of the Sungai Coemba and killed Indonesian soldiers with mathematical precision were part of a sequence of events that ended in one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century. This is not an argument against what they did. They were soldiers following lawful orders in defense of a legitimate ally. It is an argument for understanding the full weight of what it means to fight a war, that consequences radiate outward in ways that no briefing paper anticipates, and that the history of a conflict does not end when the last ambush is sprung and the last patrol crosses back to safety. Sukarno's authority dissolved with the speed that all authoritarian power dissolves when the military that sustains it turns away. In March of 1966, he signed the document that transferred emergency powers to Suharto and effectively ended his presidency, though he retained the title until 1967. He died on the 21st of June, 1970, under house arrest in Jakarta, still the most famous Indonesian of his era, stripped of everything except the reputation that had been the only instrument he had ever really trusted. The man who declared he would gobble Malaysia raw died without having managed to swallow it. Suharto's government, focused on stabilizing a shattered economy and consolidating political authority, had no interest in continuing an expensive military campaign in Borneo that was losing on every operational measure. Peace talks between Malaysia and Indonesia began in April of 1966. On the 11th of August, 1966, the two governments signed a peace treaty in Bangkok. Malaysian and British Commonwealth forces in Borneo ceased operations the following day. The war that had never officially been declared was over. The final toll was 114 Commonwealth soldiers dead and 181 wounded. On the Indonesian side, 590 killed, 222 wounded, 771 captured. Of the Commonwealth dead, 22 were Australian, 7 killed on operations, the remainder lost to accidents, illness, a vehicle collision, and 1 to a wild elephant. 6 Australians were killed in action across the entire conflict, in a war fought against an adversary that deployed its best soldiers against them. The SASR lost 3 men in Borneo. None of them died in enemy contact. The soldiers who came home to a country that did not know where they had been. There were no ceremonies. There was no public acknowledgement of anything that had occurred in Borneo. There were instructions. The cross-border operations were classified. The details of individual engagements were classified. And the fact of Australian combat inside Indonesian sovereign territory was classified. The families of men who had been wounded inside Kalimantan were told their wounds had been sustained inside Malaysia. This was not security protocol extended beyond its reasonable boundaries. It was a structured program of institutional dishonesty applied to the men who had fought the war and the families who had waited for them. It would continue, officially, for 31 years. Britain acknowledged its Claret operations in 1974, 8 years after the peace treaty, without substantial public notice, into the noise of a world that had moved on to the fall of Saigon and the resignation of Richard Nixon and approximately 100 other crises that seemed more immediately pressing. Australia said nothing. The official acknowledgement of Australian involvement in Operation Claret did not arrive until the publication of the official history by Peter Dennis and Geoffrey Gray in 1996, 30 years after the peace treaty, 31 years after Major Broderick's patrol crossed the border into Kalimantan for the first time. By that point, Vietnam had consumed an entire generation of national memory. The men who had fought in Borneo were in their 50s and 60s. The story arrived effectively into silence. It received no serious public attention. It has received almost none since. The silence had costs beyond the historical record. The men of 3RAR, who executed the Konfrontasi ambush campaign in 1965, were simultaneously being oriented toward Vietnam, their officers sent on 2-week familiarization tours to the country they would soon be deploying to, the battalion itself preparing for a commitment that would come within months of their return from Borneo. The success in Borneo was real, demonstrable, and significant. It also created a dangerous institutional confidence. The Australian Army had just proven, at extraordinarily low cost, that a small professional force using Walker's principles, intelligence before firepower, patience over mass, indigenous partnership over technological substitution, could dominate a jungle counterinsurgency campaign against an enemy that outnumbered it dramatically. This was true in Borneo. The error was in concluding that it was true everywhere, in every conflict, against every enemy, under every set of political conditions. Vietnam was not Borneo. The enemy was different. The scale was different. The American involvement changed every calculation. The political objective, never clearly defined, was fundamentally different from the clear and achievable aim of defending a specific border. The lessons of Konfrontasi were real. The willingness to examine whether they transferred was insufficient. The price of that insufficiency was paid in lives that the success of Borneo gave no one adequate reason to anticipate losing. The Australian SASR that went from Borneo to Vietnam carried something genuine from the jungle of Sarawak, a proven capacity to operate in small teams deep in hostile territory, to treat intelligence gathering as the primary operational activity rather than a support function, and to build relationships with local populations that produced actionable information rather than alienation. These qualities made the SASR consistently effective in Vietnam in ways that larger conventional formations were not. They are visible today in how Australian Special Forces operate in every theater they have entered since. The thread from the first Claret patrol on the 24th of May, 1965, runs directly and unbroken through Vietnam, through East Timor, through the mountains of Afghanistan. The regiment that exists today, one of the most capable special operations forces in the world, was made in Borneo, in a war that its own government spent 31 years pretending had not happened. There is one consequence of the Konfrontasi that stands above all others in its scale and in the completeness of the world's failure to connect it to these events. On the 8th of August, 1967, 1 year and 3 days after the Bangkok Peace Treaty, representatives of 5 nations gathered in Bangkok and signed the document that created the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, The 5 founding members were Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. 2 of those founding members had spent the preceding 3 years trying to destroy each other through military force, economic warfare, subversion, and propaganda. 18 months before ASEAN's founding, Indonesian and Malaysian soldiers were killing each other in the jungle of Borneo. Australian soldiers were ambushing Indonesian supply columns inside Kalimantan. The peace treaty that ended the Konfrontasi was not simply a ceasefire between 2 exhausted antagonists. It was the beginning of a reconciliation so complete that the former enemies agreed to sit at the same table with their neighbors and build a framework for regional cooperation that has maintained the peace in Southeast Asia for more than 50 years. ASEAN today encompasses 10 member states and more than 670 million people. Its combined economy is the 5th largest in the world. Its foundational principle, that nations with profound differences of history, culture, religion, and strategic interest can resolve their disputes through dialogue rather than force, was demonstrated as viable by the resolution of a conflict that every party involved had reason to allow to become something much worse. Every ASEAN summit is, in the most direct historical sense, a monument built on the foundation of a war the world forgot. The peace that Southeast Asia lives in today, the trade, the development, the absence of the interstate warfare that has consumed other regions, was purchased partly in the jungle of Borneo by men who removed their identity discs before crossing the border and were ordered not to discuss what they had done when they came back. They are mostly gone now, the men who crossed the border. The jungle has grown back over every trace of their passage. The Sungai Coemba moves through Kalimantan in the same direction it always has. The track near Kindau where Douglas Byers lay in silence for 3 days carries no marker. The border between Indonesia and Malaysia is a destination for nature tourism today. You can stand on the Malaysian side and look across at Indonesia and see nothing to indicate that anything of consequence ever happened there, except the slow work of weather and time. Nothing except the border itself, the same border that European administrators drew in London, that Sukarno decided he would erase, that Walter Walker decided he would defend from the wrong side of, and that a small number of Australian soldiers protected at a cost their country spent 31 years refusing to acknowledge. At the beginning of this, I asked you whether you had heard of the Konfrontasi before today. Most of you had not. There is a reason for that, and the reason is not that the war was unimportant. The war shaped the strategic character of the entire Asia-Pacific region. It forged the institution that Australian Special Forces remain today. It helped end a nuclear-adjacent crisis before the nuclear dimension became operational. And then it helped create the diplomatic framework through which 670 million people live in relative peace. The men who fought it were ordered to be invisible, managed by governments that needed them to remain unacknowledged, and buried under the weight of a larger and louder conflict that consumed the entire public imagination of their era. The men who removed their identification discs in 1965 knew what they were walking toward. They did not know that the world would spend 60 years walking past what they had done. Now you do. If this story deserves to be told, and it does, share it. These men were owed an audience 60 years ago. Better late than silent.